centres of power. You've got Frankfurt, that's the sort of financial hub. You've got Berlin, that's the political and cultural hub. You've got Hamburg, which is the richest area of the country, which is trade and is the port centre. You've got Dortmund and the Ruhr, the sort of former industrial areas, which actually have rejuvenated themselves in a modern service economy. And we've got to think about how exactly we redistribute those national assets to different parts of the country. And for me, a big part of that, and one of the things that we can most directly control, is the centre of political power. So I think I'm right in saying that the renovation of Parliament is going to cost roughly £10 billion. A staggering sum of money. The alternative is to let the Palace of Westminster slip into the Thames, and after what we've seen over the past few years, I won't be against that, and let them all go going with it. But while that process is happening, does it not provide a perfect opportunity for us to say, even for a short period of time, why doesn't Parliament go on tour, for example? Why doesn't it have a different centre of power? Because what would happen then is that you'd get people like myself and my colleagues, journalists, moving with power. You'd get civil servants naturally moving with power. And you'd get outsourcing firms that rely heavily on government contracts and their access to ministers. They'd have to move. And so if you did this in a way that was sort of transitional and wasn't just like, here you go, Leeds, here's some MPs for you to deal with, I think that would actually meaningfully, I'm not saying this is what they're going to do because they're addicted to London. Many industries are just, it's their lifeblood, the capital. But if we were thinking strategically about how we were going to create a big bang moment, I'd ship them off somewhere else.
And media too would follow.
Exactly. And that's the thing about my industry, is that there have been some great initiatives around moving parts of the media to different parts of the country. Like Media City in Salford is a remarkable architectural endeavour, if nothing else. Just going and looking at what they've created there is remarkable. But ultimately, the programmes that you want to see broadcast from the north are never going to be so unless power moves, because you follow Westminster, you follow where the ministers are, and ultimately we've seen that play out with Salford in the fact that you've only got Breakfast, 5 Live, Sport that I think are based out of Salford as regular programmes, and then obviously if Radio 4 kind of goes on tour, and you've seen that play out, and I think that it will be the same with Channel 4 in Leeds, unfortunately.
And you mentioned briefly architecture. I was interested in what you said in the book about the newer buildings in the devolved areas that didn't have this adversarial one set on one, politicians on one side and one on the other, but the architecture actually informed the debate and the approach to discussion in politics.
Yeah, and it was striking talking to devolved politicians about this as well. It's a sense of the sort of dark, stuffy corridors of Westminster really breathes an air, I think, of elitism, of cronyism, of sort of dodgy deals in back rooms, an old boys club. It's easy to dismiss architecture, but it sets the tempo of a place. It establishes what sort of politics you want to establish. And I think it's a funny fact that they built the House of Commons green benches far enough apart that two swords couldn't touch one another. And so that's how medieval our political institutions are built still to this day in Westminster.
Moving on to housing, in one of your chapters you talked about how we need to save the capital from itself. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the inequalities around housing and also how it links with work, for example, internships and low-wage jobs.
Yeah, this is the biggest conversation actually that I've had since publishing the book, is trying to convince people from London, very well-meaning people, who I think share my sense of injustice around inequality, that we're not coming for we're not picking their pocket here. By improving the fortunes of other regions, we help London. Because London's overheated. It's an absolutely ridiculous state of affairs. You just have to browse Rightmove for 5 minutes to see how ludicrous it is. I posted on Twitter the other day, actually, a £785,000 two-bedroom flat in central London that was completely uninhabitable. Completely. 700 square feet. Completely uninhabitable. And this creates I think this creates a huge problem that nobody is dealing with. Because as a young person now, we've essentially gone through, coming up to, 15 years of stagnant wage growth, that's still not matching inflation. Inflation's rampant at the minute. And so as a young person, you're still getting paid the same wages that you were back in 2008 at the moment of the financial crash. But house prices have boomed. Rents are through the roof. And so as one of those young people trying to come from, a more peripheral region or a more deprived background, how exactly are you going to access the opportunities that London holds in its exclusive grasp? You can't. And so you have to limit your expectations. And as a result, we're creating a system, we're creating an economy and a society in which it's only those from London who can live at home and who might, or most probably will, inherit a substantial amount of wealth that has accrued over the past 20, 30 years since their parents bought that house. It's only those people who can first access the opportunities, the internships, as you mentioned, that are essential to access certainly journalism. I started at the BBC through work experience, advertising, acting, the arts. How is anybody supposed to access the arts, which is famously one of the lowest paid industries when you first start out? It's now impossible. And so we're creating this homogenous, posh, London-based blob that basically has consumed all of our key national industries. And I think that's bad in terms of inequality and fairness. And it's also boring. I don't want to see those people on TV all the time. I want to see the angry young men and women of the north, making a steak and, shaking some feathers. And you just don't, as far as I'm concerned, you just don't see that, and certainly not compared to, even 10, 20 years ago. And that's in large part because of the housing crisis, which is created by everything being captured by London.
Do you think it's changed a tiny bit since COVID and the pandemic, the effect of more people working from home and some people moving out of London, or is it kind of barely any effect?
It had a momentary impact. Rents stagnated, even deflated for probably about a year to 18 months, and now they've bounced back in spectacular fashion, and people talking about their rents inflating 100% in the past few months. Don't know precisely the cause of that. Some of it will be supply side, but a lot of it is demand side. Is the fact that ultimately we haven't devolved our economy to the extent that was speculated. I think lots of people, rather than being able to up sticks and move somewhere like this or Leeds or another big city, they're required to work on a hybrid basis. And so they work from home a couple of days and then they have to commute into London for the rest of the time, which essentially means that they have to be within London's orbit still. And so COVID hasn't really fixed that problem, unfortunately. And in fact, it's created a lot of housing problems for places on the periphery of London, in the sense that lots of people who lived in their central London, houses that had accrued in value arbitrarily over the past 20 to 30 years, decided, well, I've got this asset, I don't really need to go into the office anymore, I'm just going to liquidate it. I'm going to sell up, I'm going to move somewhere that's close to London, but I don't have to be in the centre of London anymore. So you've got lots of satellite towns on the edges of London, like sort of Reading, for example, even like Margate, which is on the coast, but it's sort of a hipster haven now because of all the people flocking out of London. Brighton, etc. And their house prices have boomed, but without the London living standards, without the London wages to support the local economy. So you've essentially got poor people in those places being priced out altogether, which has created a new dynamic to the London housing crisis altogether.
Yeah, I think that's been the case for a while in places like Brighton, hasn't it? Even before COVID, that people commuted in and caused that issue.
Yeah.
I was going to say let's move on to politics. It's all political in one way. Just specifically that you noted that in the book that London has more Labour MPs than anywhere else in the country. And you mentioned that the British left's application of intersectionality doesn't currently extend to geography, which I thought was a really interesting point. Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I feel as though the left's in a real bind. I mean, we've known this since 2019, really, and the question is, what does it do about it? Steadily, the left was losing its red wall seats, you know, from the high point of '97 onwards, and then eventually the dam broke, and it lost a whole host of those seats to the Conservatives. And you know, I tried to answer in a couple of chapters in the book, you know, why has that happened? And I think to a large degree, the Labour Party has been captured by the same London addiction as many other industries, and the routes into the Labour Party have been stymied. Essentially, you've got to be, you know, well, not in all cases, but in lots of cases, especially during the Blair years, you know, it was a case of parachuting the favoured special advisors from Whitehall into northern seats, and that wasn't a good precedent to set, and I think lots of people noticed that. The trade union movement has obviously, you know, separated somewhat, well, Labour has separated from the trade union movement, I should put it that way around. And so that natural avenue from trade unions, which are, you know, regionally focused, down into being parliamentary candidates or being, you know, at the centre of Labour politics, has really been, has again been stymied. And so Labour, just for one thing, it looks more London-centric because it is. More of its thought leaders are based in London than ever before. But as a result, I think it has articulated in recent times a more London-centric attitude to lots of issues, which, you know, I feel as though it's been punished at the ballot box for. And yeah, I think you mentioned intersectionality, and it's an incredibly important point. In the same way, it's again a big conversation that I've been having. In the same way that I'm not saying to Londoners, I'm coming for, you know, I want to pick your pocket. I'm not saying that region is more important than lots of other inequalities out there at the minute. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm not saying that region should take precedence above all these other issues that we know British society suffers from currently. I'm saying it needs to sit alongside and intersect these issues. So region and class is the most obvious one. You know, it's been happening for generations. You know, there's a very ingrained sense of class discrimination on regional lines in this country. But also, you know, people from non-white backgrounds in the north, you know, by improving the circumstances of regions outside of London, we will benefit that cause as well. And it's not the case of saying region top trumps everything else. It's not. It sits alongside and complements all these other forms of injustice.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that the red wall's been crumbling for some time, although I did read this week that there's possibly a bit of a boost, and I hesitate to mention the B word. Do you think it was largely Brexit related, or do you think there was a lot more at play?
I think a lot of it was Brexit. I personally think a considerable amount of it was Corbyn as well. Mary Cray said to me, who was the Wakefield MP, she said if you wanted to design a candidate more off-putting to the north, you probably couldn't have picked someone better than Jeremy Corbyn. And I think that's a bit extreme, but I can certainly see where she was coming from. So it was that combination of Brexit and Corbyn, and particularly how I think Corbyn was written up. You know, he was demonised, there's no question about that. But unfortunately he provided a lot of material for the press to latch onto. It's interesting though, I think we've spoken a lot about the loss of the Red Wall, and actually not a lot at all about what has happened since and what might happen at the next election. Because like you say, on current polling, Labour will sweep the floor, and it will be a completely different narrative going into 2024 when the election will probably happen. And I think Brexit has got a lot to do with that as well, because if you look at the polling on Brexit in parallel, people on the wall think that Brexit is going really badly, really badly. They, I think rightly think that Brexit hasn't, basically, Brexit might provide a buffer during the cost of living crisis. It was supposed to be these sunlit uplands, and we're hoping it would deliver sooner rather than later, and it hasn't. I think they were also betrayed by the person who brought Brexit in Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson was this, it's incredible the way that he managed this actually, being an old Etonian. He sort of branded himself as this man of the people. I've been sent from the north, from the Red Wall, to fight against the Westminster establishment and to even battle against his own party. If we remember, one of his first acts was to kick out 21 Conservative MPs, right? And so he came as a man of the north, a real rogue presence, representing those who hate the established order of things in Westminster, quite rightly. And then Partygate happens, and people realise, and I don't think it was really necessarily Partygate itself, not necessarily the law breaking and the rule breaking, etc. It was his constant lying about it. It was his constant, oh no, I've done everything right, I did everything properly, when it was just patently the case that he hadn't. And so I think people it was like this pact had been broken. The sacrifices that we'd all have had to make, and especially people in deprived communities that suffered from the virus more than anyone else, they saw that this man actually was willing to lie to them. And so I think the whole sort of house of cards has come tumbling down, both the perception of Boris Johnson and within that, the perception of Brexit. And you see now that there's a clear majority for rejoining the EU. So I think, equally in the sense that it's important to reflect on why 2019 happened, I think it's even more important not to lose sight of our current political circumstances, and they have changed dramatically, actually, in the past few years, and I think we'll see that play out next year.
Yeah. Looking at national media, most is based in London and run largely by people who are white male and public school educated. I worked myself as a sub-editor on The Guardian for 8 years, and I remember a colleague being really shocked to hear that I attended a Midland comprehensive school. And that just looking back at that, I thought, well, surely The Guardian of all places would have quite a mix of people, but it really didn't. So can you tell us a little bit about your experiences as a journalist? Because I was there between 2000 and 2008, so I'm sure I don't know, have things changed, or does it depend which aspect of the media you're in?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to, I guess, my experiences and the people that I know immediately. But yeah, it's still the case that, especially in senior positions, it's the old Etonian class that rule. I'd say that, strikingly, to me at least, region is not taken into account in the current drive to ensure the representation of all parts of British society. When I was first starting out at the BBC, there really wasn't any sense, aside from one or two, very helpful editors, that I was making great personal sacrifices to compete with people who were basically commuting half an hour on the tube from their family home. This was fairly unstable freelance work, for periods of time, like 6 weeks during an election campaign, for example, where I'd come down on the train on a Monday morning from Wakefield, a couple of hours down to King's Cross, then hop it over to New Broadcasting House, stay at an Airbnb all week, and then hop it back on the train on a Friday night up north, and then do the same every single week. And that, you know, you gotta have some sort of sense of like, this is what I really want to do, because you're pushed to the limit of what you can achieve mentally and physically during that process of commuting and then going to a different place, living there every week, trying to sustain, you know, your own sanity during that process, versus these people who are, you know, waltzing into the office, you know, with a Pret coffee, you know, half an hour late. You know, it's tricky, and like I say, I don't think there's a great recognition of that difficulty from people from different regions, or how that might be counterbalanced.
I'm just thinking of the time. I've got lots more questions, but we'll take some from the audience as well. I'll just ask one more, and then we'll also take some from the audience at home, because I'm sure people have lots of thoughts and opinions on these subjects. I just wanted to ask a little bit about devolution. So obviously, we now have a West Yorkshire mayor in Tracy Brown, and I wondered what you thought about your home area, region of Yorkshire and West Yorkshire in particular. Do you feel we just should have a lot more autonomy and powers? And obviously that would need to be backed by funding.
Yeah, well, the announcements today on the West Midlands and Greater Manchester on giving them more powers, brilliant. I think the problem with devolution as it currently stands is that it's very much a patchwork. You see lots of, I mean, like Greater Manchester, you see them covered by a mayor with more powers than any other region, and by a national figurehead as well, which I don't think we can underestimate the power of. And then you've got other parts of the country where they've got no real devolved settlement whatsoever. So I think the first thing that we've got to do is to fill in the gaps, really. I think trying to start again and reimagine what devolution should look like in an ideal world will push us on another 10 or 20 years, and then, you know, it won't happen. So we've got to fill in the blanks of what the government's currently doing. And then I think we've got to think about combining the power of larger regions within that devolved settlement. So I would be you know, strongly in favour of having, you know, a Council of the North type arrangement, or a Northern Assembly that could speak to issues like transport. I mean, the Transpennine issue, because it is an issue, the petrol issue, is one that will be solved between East and West. And so to have Yorkshire and Manchester sort of in silos, I think doesn't really make a great deal of sense. And to compete with the power of the South East, I think that's going to have to be necessary. I think you're going to have South East, South West, Midlands and the North, each as separate regional entities. But that's you know, that's got to come in time. And to be honest, Labour's proposals that have been steered by Gordon Brown look pretty good on devolution. So I'm relatively optimistic on both parties, actually, in terms of their desire to carry it forward.
So you don't think independence for Yorkshire?
Not yet.
No. Okay, we'll take a couple of questions from the floor and then a couple from at home. The lady here.
Hi Sam, I'm from London. And I moved to Yorkshire last week. And like you, I'm a writer. And my publisher has offices all over the north. And my daughter was one of those A-star morons that you call them, except that she was on a full scholarship at her private school, is autistic, and goes to the University of Leeds. What I'm trying to say is I think there's a little more nuance, and what I think would benefit all of us, all over the country, is dialogue and understanding. And I think that it's quite easy to take a pop at London. I lived there for most of my life. It's very expensive, housing's very expensive, but as a single mum, I managed to raise a kid, even though we didn't have much money. And people in London, we have breakfast clubs, we're not all rich, we all get along, we have community. And we would like to kind of, I think, we're not so London-centric as you've laid out. I think we would like dialogue, and we would genuinely like to get to know, you know, I've moved here. So I'm assuming you polarised it that much for the purposes of your book.
So you haven't read it?
Not yet, I'm going to.
Okay. That's fine. That's entirely fine. That is entirely fine. And I often read the headline of the article and presume that's what it means when it doesn't. Like I said, this is a conversation that I've been having more about the book than any other conversation. And I acknowledge within it, and have acknowledged frequently afterwards, that the poverty rate in London is higher than any other region in the country, right? There are more people in poverty in London than there are members of any other city, actually. But how do we solve that? We don't solve that by, I think, defending the status quo. That's not going to work. What is going to work is redistributing power and wealth in this country to other regions, so that people like yourself, like me, like my colleagues, can work in other parts of the country. And so house prices in London, rents in London aren't as expensive as they are, there is nothing that will solve London's poverty rate faster than people actually moving out of the capital and rents going down. So my book is not, London is the worst thing ever to have happened to this country. I think London's values, to a large degree, are the values that I share, and I believe we need to aspire towards. Okay, so I'm not one of those, Darren Grimes, reactionary northerners who's saying, London's this wokerati, latte drinking, metropolitan elite haven. I did mention Pret. There are Prets up north. They're not going to have a Greggs, are they?
I love Greggs.
Yeah.
We have Greggs in Hammersmith.
I'll make sure to visit next time I'm down. I'll make sure that I'll visit next time I'm down. But that's not where I'm coming from at all. So I can understand why you would get that impression from the cover of the book, but...
No, it's from what you said tonight. I got the impression from you.
Okay. But it's about redistribution to benefit the country, to save London from itself, as much as it is to save the rest of the country from London.
Do you have any other questions? The gentleman at the back there.
Just to kind of take the title of the book and stretch the metaphor a little bit. So, fortress sort of implies something defensive. I've got an idea that money has gravity, so the more money you have, the more money tends to gravitate around it. Yeah. And London seems to be an extreme, so you have extremes of poverty and extremes of wealth. As you're looking forward, and whether you're looking at Brexit, whether you're looking at the declining role of the UK globally, politically, militarily, financially, do you see the future of London moving away from money, as in international money and regional money will move away from London to other financial centres around the world, and that will help solve it? Or do you see a future of London being a deregulation as we move away from the rest of the global financial systems, and more money coming into London, and really, really kind of hyper the system that you've got at the moment of extreme wealth and poverty? So I guess the question is, going forward, do you see things continuing as they are and ramping up, as you were saying about rent, or do you see money moving away from London internationally, and the system that we've got at the moment forcibly declining and towards coming down?
I think, sadly, I only see things getting worse. I mean, obviously we'll have to see how it plays out through Brexit, but that does pose a threat to London. There's talk, and I've no doubt that this has already happened, that jobs have already left for the likes of Paris, Frankfurt, etc. And I think in the absence of a more developed economic philosophy that might, redistribute the economy to other parts of the country and, engender greater productivity that would then produce tax revenues, which is basically what the government's essentially bothered about. In the absence of that, I think it's probably going to, as we've seen through Truss and actually Jeremy Hunt, it's going to go and try and do Big Bang 2.0 in the City of London and deregulate and go for actually a new era of Thatcherism with basically let's try and suck as much tax revenue as we can out of London because we've got no other idea of how we do it, because that's basically what we've done for the past 40 or 50 years. And then levelling up is kind of stitched on in a very prosaic, gimmicky way in terms of like we're going to give like 10 million to a community centre here and 20 million there, and it sounds like a lot of money, but fundamentally it's not. I mean, the Centre for Cities has estimated that we need to properly level up and to just start to erode the regional inequalities in this country. We need £2 trillion of investment, which is twice our GDP. That's the scale that it took to get East and West Germany closer in terms of, I mean, in terms of productivity, the gap between London and everywhere else is greater than the gap between East and West Germany. That is the scale of the task that we're facing here. You know, and I don't need to recall, you know, the circumstances that East Germany were in the not too distant past. But yeah, like I say, I can't see optimistically, you know, as optimistic as I am, I actually can't see, yeah, I can't see that much hope.
We'll take a question from our online viewers. If
I've got two questions.
Okay.
First is from Daniel Scott. What does Sam think of HS2? It seems increasingly unlikely it will reach Manchester. Far better to invest in improving regional rail links and services, Trans-Pennine especially.
This is very controversial.
Yeah, I do mention it in the book. I mean, I think I sort of flipped with HS2. I think if you were looking at it, you know, on a blank piece of paper, you know, someone had drawn it, and if we knew actually at the start how much it was going to cost, and I've done a bit of work on this, and there was some dodgy stuff going on in terms of the covering up of how much HS2 was going to cost, and they knew how much it was going to cost before it was announced to Parliament, a much reduced figure. And so if we'd known at that stage it was going to cost £100 billion, I'd say no, it's not really worth that amount of money. Now that it's started, I kind of think that you've got to follow through with it. You know, the tunnels are being bored, you know, the stations are being built. I think it would be a huge waste of money to get rid of it. But and I spoke to Andrew Adonis from my book and asked him about this because it was one of his, you know, brain children. And he said the worst thing to do would not be to scrap HS2, but would be to do it half-hearted. And you know, there's the initial problem of just having it go to Birmingham, which would create a new sort of focal point of economic power in the country from Birmingham southwards. But if they just do it to Manchester and Crewe and leave out Leeds, that means that you'll be able to get from Manchester to London in what, an hour, a little over an hour, and it will still take you 2 hours and 20 minutes to get from Leeds to London. And so
But it's going to take you an hour to get to Huddersfield from Leeds. I mean, you know, so it's great having high speed railway, but if you can't actually get from, I live in Hendon Bridge, I'm from Hendon Bridge, and I used to go down to St Park, I lived there for a while. Yeah. But if realistically, getting from Leeds to London or Manchester to London takes you 2 hours, but the journey from Hendon Bridge to Leeds will take you an hour and a half. It's fast.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, to your point on the local rail links, it's absolutely essential, and to me it was one of the most glaring lessons of the 2019.
We're also moving into an AI-based economy. So as somebody local, you'll know that the Peace Hall was built and then it was no longer fit for purpose. That was 200 years ago, 210 years ago, and ceased to be fit for purpose on completion. By the time HS2 is finished, is it going to be fit for purpose? It is a really good point. And Hunt talked today about creating investment zones. I don't know if you saw this, 12 investment zones around the UK, like the latest levelling up gimmick, basically, that are based around universities. And in theory, great idea, right? Universities like this one have been brilliant for many, you know, towns in the Midlands and the North, right? And they've got research capacity that should be more closely knitted into the local economy. Absolutely bang on, right? But how do you connect the sort of left behind parts of the country to those new innovation zones, to those new research hubs? At the minute, people are left behind because they physically can't get there. They can't get a train that would take them there, to work there, to live there. But surely, as somebody who's
work remotely. You see that it's moving in that direction, and lots of people are working and coming to the north, and so it's about empowering the north and actually saying that we have better connections, better to actually invest in something.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, the internet's another, broadband's another absolutely farcical situation in this country, so yeah.
I noticed you had your hand up earlier. Do you have a particular question? Could
I
I
just
ask also
wanted to know
that
if you talked about populism at all.
Populism?
Because I've really felt that Brexit was a one policy election, and it wasn't about a holistic country, and those attitudes have changed when people actually think it's affected them immediately.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I've got another book coming out actually in the next few weeks that talks more directly to populism over the past few years, called Bullied in Club Britain, which is about the leaders who've, you know, put us in this mess, and essentially, you know, their populist tactics, their culture wars that they've stoked, have been a distraction technique, and Brexit was one of them. I genuinely don't think that any one of the people who sat in that room and negotiated Brexit knew what they were doing. Like, I do not think that Boris Johnson had the first idea of how Brexit would affect the British economy. I don't think he cared, actually, how it would affect the British economy or how it would affect the North. All he wanted was to win that election and then to find another culture war campaign to bounce him onto a second election victory for his own self-aggrandizement. That's it. And so, yeah, no, I think that, unfortunately, the Red Wall has been had, but, you know, I take solace in the fact that it seems that people have realised that pretty quickly. You know, it's taken nearly one election cycle for us all to realise that the game's up. You know, I was worried during COVID because, you know, I think that the North and plenty deprived areas had been punished during that time by the missteps of the government. And Johnson's poll ratings weren't going down.
Sorry, I've got some more questions.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we're going to give the chance for other people in the room to ask questions, but also we do have some more online. So, Michelle, do you want to read another one out?
Sam, in your book, I was fascinated to read of the health disparities of people outside London, particularly for people of colour. Do you think that this will continue?
Yes, I mean, health inequalities are inextricably linked to economic inequalities, and like I say, if I'm not optimistic about that being solved anytime soon, then the health of the country is going to get, the health of regions and of deprived communities in poor areas is going to continue to be a problem, undoubtedly, especially during a time of inflation, low economic growth, an unwillingness of the government to put the necessary both structural reform and just raw cash into the health service and the social causes of poor health. You know, austerity has had a long tail, and I don't think austerity is over by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think we're out of the woods on that. And there's no feasible plan to reverse it, to make sure that deprived communities are no longer deprived. So, yeah, unfortunately, yes.
Did you have another one from online, and then we'll go back in okay, we'll go back into the room. Do we have other questions, gentlemen? Then?
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm just wondering. Great book, by the way. I see myself a lot in it because I went to Green myself, coming from around the corner, trying to get a job in London, but not succeeding. But I'm just thinking, do you see the Labour Party at the moment, or any credible opposition, as being full of the vision and the solutions to actually address this? Because personally, I don't for a bit. But what do you think it will take from a political party to address some of these things?
I have to say, on political reform, constitutional reform, devolution, I think Labour's in a really good spot. I think that the sort of corruption and the wrongdoing of the past few years has kind of bounced it into this position where it's taken up a really strong position on like second jobs, you know, draining the swamp, as it says, which is actually linked in ways that I didn't first appreciate is linked to levelling up, because it's talking about, you know, moving power away from corrupt Westminster, etc. So I think actually through the Brown Review, it's adopted a really good position, and actually Lisa Nandy has changed her position since I wrote the book on structural reform. So that's really good. I say economically, Labour has kind of overcompensated in many ways because it doesn't want to be seen as, you know, pouring money in a cavalier way, you know, and opening itself up to the same old attacks from the Conservatives. So fiscally, it's kind of retrenching in a very kind of, you know, early Blairite fashion. You know, we're going to balance the books, etc., etc. So rhetorically, at least, I'm not that optimistic because I don't think Labour's given the sort of commitments that you would need to see to, like I say, to have those tens of hundreds of billions of pounds to redistribute wealth in this country. But let's see what it does in office. It's much easier for a government to set the economic narrative than it is for an opposition. So I can definitely see why Labour is pitching itself in the way that it is at the minute. And one thing that we can take solace in is, you know, it has pledged a ton of money for green investment. You know, £30 billion a year for green investment, which it says it's going to dedicate to left behind areas of the country. And so, you know, I agree with plenty of campaigners in that sense that our job is to tell them where exactly that money should be spent. So there are things to be hopeful about in Labour's approach, as long as it can break that fiscal austerity when it gets into office.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions, but do bear in mind that you can talk to Sam afterwards. He'll be signing his books. And if you're watching online, please do go to Read Bookshop, who were based in Homefirth, who are providing the books tonight, if you'd like to order a copy of the book. You can order online, of course.
What solutions do you need?
Sorry, can we take a question from someone who hasn't spoken yet to give other people a chance? Lady here.
Yeah, I think there's a question about what sort of language we use to describe these issues as well, which hasn't really been touched on much this evening. I think terms like Red Wall and always talking down the north are not very helpful, because actually the regions in the north have huge amount of skills, expertise, knowledge, exciting, interesting places and areas to go to that we could talk up. And I think there's an awful lot of doom and gloom talked about. I mean, I know there is the whole issue of inequality, but I think we do need to talk up the north and in our areas about what they have to offer. I mean, we've got a literature festival here. We should be talking about language and how we use it, because, and I think associated with that, we'll be talking about the infrastructure and the money that Labour has been talking about putting in, talking about it investing in things, not seeing it as a waste of money. And it's the way you talk about things that can make a real difference. I just wondered what your angle is on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I've been reading a new book out recently, which I'd recommend as a compliment to mine, by Alex Niven, called The North Will Rise Again, where he tracks the history of the North and its sense of modernism and its sense of economic forward thinking, that I think speaks very directly to what you're saying. You know, and I'd love to see Labour set out in a way that's quite different from the Conservatives, how it's going to invest in meaningful, exciting ways that aren't gimmicky, that, you know, are transformative. And at the minute, I think it's kind of plonked 30 billion on the table and said, well, you know, make do with that. We'll figure it out when we get into power. But in terms of the North sense of itself, yeah, I think that would be brilliant. And I think in terms of the institutions of power as well, away from Westminster, I would love to see more national assets talking about the regional leadership more. You know, if indeed they have it. You know, and credit to Channel 4 for coming up and building what looks like a great HQ in Leeds, and that's one way that it can be celebrated. But I think we need to also be realistic. I think there's an issue with talking up the North so much that people think that we don't need, you know, investment and we don't need things to change. And so it's about finding that delicate balance between showing the potential of the North, but also saying, you know,
let's try and not do things the way that they have been done in recent decades.
Okay, we'll take a final question.
Do you feel that economically London is still part of this country, or do you think it's actually a global city that, for historic reasons, happens to be in the southeast of England?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I feel as though I'm going to maybe back myself into a corner. Again, with the lady behind you. It's absolutely true that London is different from the rest of the country economically. I mean, it's 50% more productive than Yorkshire. It's 30% more productive than the nationwide average. Its house prices are double the national average. On pretty much every single metric. I mean, it's 10 times the size of our second biggest city. On every single metric, it does stand out, which is why I picked, London, because, every bit of data that you look at, London stands out as an outlier. It's also at the centre of the oligarchy. It's, the place that, unfortunately, the Russian mafia has decided to deposit its cash. So yes, I'd say it stands alongside the likes of, New York and Paris and, Hong Kong to a lesser extent now, but those big global cities, and does look very different from the rest of the country economically. I'd say that my one caveat to that would be, I'm working there, the gentleman over there is looking for a job down there. London is actually populated by lots of people, in fact the majority of people, not from London. So it is actually a composite of all these other places as well. So in that way it is very much stitched into the fabric of who we are and actually who we are regionally as well. And I think a big part of our regional identity now is actually welcoming people either who've moved back up from London, or family members who've moved down there who are coming up for Christmas or whatever. That's how or the brain drain, people who've moved there after going to university. That's the way that we experience London. I don't think we experience it in a silo, actually, even if when you look at the data, it does seem like a dramatic outlier.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's been a fascinating discussion. As I say, there's the opportunity to speak to Sam afterwards. He's going to be signing books. Please do buy the book. It's a really interesting read. We have Lisa and Andy coming here on the 30th of March to the university at lunchtime. And we also have Stuart McConey, whose new book, The Full English, takes another perspective on the 2nd of April. So do have a look at the brochures we've got around, or take a look online and join us at some of our other events. Thank you again to the sponsors. I really appreciate your support. We have a feedback form, but we also have a code if you're able to use smartphones. It means that we don't have to sit and manually type everything in. So if you're online, we'll share the code, the link to the survey. It's just a short survey, but it does help with our funding, if you wouldn't mind filling that in. My colleagues over here will bring around the QR code for you to scan on your phone. And all that's left is to thank Sam very much for coming back to his hometown.